It was a typical late summer afternoon in 1971 when a group of hikers began a routine trek through the dense emerald corridors of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. They expected nothing more than the quiet solace of the towering pines and the rhythmic crunch of dry needles beneath their boots. But what they found partially hidden beneath a cluster of jagged gray rocks would change the history of this small mountain community forever. Hidden in plain sight for what appeared to be weeks, a secret was about to be unmasked, one that proved the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who live right next door, or perhaps the ones who vanish into the mist as quickly as they appear. Tonight, we look into the quiet shadows of a case that remained a frozen portrait of tragedy for over 5 decades. We are retracing the steps of a journey defined by a name that was lost to time, and a ghost that refused to stay silent. The air in the high country during that year was crisp, heavy with the scent of pine resin and the damp, earthy musk of the forest floor. In this part of the country, the nights are usually defined by the rhythmic hum of crickets and the distant, lonely call of a great horned owl. But on this particular evening in 1971, the silence felt different. It was heavy. It was expectant. As the lead hiker stepped over a fallen cedar log, his eyes caught on a color that didn't belong. A splash of synthetic fabric against the organic browns and greens of the brush. He had no way of knowing he was stepping into a story that would remain unsolved for more than 50 years. A mystery that would eventually require a leap in science that no one in 1971 could have possibly imagined. Close your eyes and visualize the rugged, unforgiving landscape of the mountains as we begin our first chapter. The scene the investigators encountered was one of profound, unsettling stillness. The victim was found in a remote area, far enough from the main trail to suggest that whoever brought them here knew the terrain, or at least they knew how to navigate the shadows of the old-growth forest. The initial responders from the sheriff's department had to hike in, their boots sinking into the damp mast of the forest floor, carrying heavy equipment through a corridor of silent, towering pines. When they reached the site, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decaying cedar. There, resting in a natural depression in the earth, was the mystery that would haunt this county for the next half-century. The victim was a young woman, likely in her late teens or early 20s. She was dressed in clothing that suggested she hadn't prepared for a hike in the wilderness. A simple patterned blouse and denim, outfits meant for a day in the city or a walk through a quiet neighborhood. There was no identification, no purse, no wallet, not even a piece of jewelry that might bear an initial or a sentimental engraving. It was as if she had been erased from the world before being left here, under the canopy of the stars. Investigators at the scene noted the meticulous way she had been placed. This wasn't a frantic disposal. It was a deliberate act. As the medical examiner arrived, the task of documenting the site began under the flickering light of handheld torches, as the sun had long since dipped below the jagged mountain peaks. The silence of the woods was broken only by the scratching of pencils on clipboards and the occasional pop of a flashbulb. They found several small items nearby: a stray button, a peculiar hair tie, but nothing that whispered a name. In those early days of 1971, the investigation moved with the rhythmic, slow pace of the era. Detectives combed through missing persons reports across 3 states, looking for a girl with her hair color, her height, her build. They visited high schools and local diners, showing sketches that were meticulously drawn by a forensic artist, hoping for a spark of recognition. But the response was always the same: a slow shake of the head and a sympathetic look. She was a ghost even then, a girl who seemed to have come from nowhere and belonged to no one. The autopsy provided few comforts. While it confirmed the cause of death was a violent act, it offered no clues as to the perpetrator's identity. The biological profile was clear, yet the person behind the profile remained invisible. To the police, she became known as Jane Doe 71-04, a clinical designation for a soul that deserved a name. As the weeks turned into months, the thick files on the sheriff's desk began to collect the fine gray dust of a cold case. The local newspapers moved the story from the front page to the interior, and eventually, the mentions stopped altogether. For the family she left behind, the silence must have been agonizing. Somewhere, perhaps hundreds of miles away, a chair sat empty at a dinner table. A mother likely watched the front door every evening, waiting for a daughter who would never walk through it. But because she had been found so far from home, and because the communication between jurisdictions in 1971 was limited to mail and expensive long-distance calls, the connection was never made. The mystery victim was buried in a potter's field, her headstone marked only with a date and a number, while the forest continued to grow over the spot where she was found, slowly reclaiming the secrets of that autumn night. As we settle further into the quiet of this evening, I invite you to think about the weight of that anonymity. To be lost is one thing, but to be found and still remain unknown is a different kind of tragedy. If you're still awake and listening, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how technology has changed our ability to find our way home. Let us know where you're joining us from as we prepare to move into the decades of silence that followed, and the eventual rise of a technology that can speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The DNA was there, waiting in the dark, a tiny microscopic thread connecting the past to a future that hadn't yet been born. In the autumn of 1971, a name was erased from the world, replaced by a cold file number and a grainy black and white photograph of a face that no one seemed to recognize. For over 50 years, this individual existed only as a ghost in the forensic system, a person whose story ended in violence and whose identity was swallowed by time. The air in the evidence room where the file sat for decades always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the building. A silent repository for a life that had been reduced to a collection of typed observations and a few weathered Polaroids. The man in the sketch had a face that belonged to someone's son, perhaps someone's brother or a friend. Yet when the posters went up in the damp chill of that November, no one came forward. The silence that followed wasn't just a lack of information. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that settled over the case, turning a breathing, thinking human being into a phantom DNA Liad that would wait half a century to finally speak in the modern age. Tonight, as the rain creates a rhythmic pitter-patter against the glass, we are going to look into the box labeled 1971, Unidentified. We are going to listen to the echoes of the story that is never supposed to be told. And we are going to trace the invisible threads that connect a discarded life in the 70s to a laboratory in the present day. I'm glad you're here to help me hold this memory. If you are settling in for the night, let me know where you are watching from and what the weather is like outside your window. It helps us feel a little less alone in the quiet hours as we begin our journey into the mystery of the DNA ghost. The location where the discovery was made was the kind of place that usually went unnoticed, a stretch of land defined by the vastness of the surrounding woods and the thick fog that often rolled in from the coast. In 1971, the world was moving fast, caught in the transition between the idealism of the 60s and the grit of the 70s. But in this particular patch of earth, time seemed to have stopped. A group of hikers had been enjoying a routine autumn afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves, when they stepped off the beaten path. They expected to find nothing more than a scenic view of the valley, but what they found beneath a cluster of overgrown ferns would change the history of this county forever. It was a discovery that felt wrong from the moment they saw it, a splash of color that didn't belong to the natural landscape, a stillness that was too profound to be ignored. When the first responding officer arrived, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the scene. He would later recall that the silence of the woods that evening felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, expectant hush. The victim lay as if they had simply been discarded. A human being treated like a secret that someone wanted to bury and forget. There were no identification papers, no wallet, no jewelry that might hint at a life lived elsewhere. There was only the body, the cold air, and the realization that a life had been extinguished in a place where no one was supposed to look. According to the initial police report, the scene was processed with the best tools of the era, which by today's standards were tragically limited. They took black and white photographs, they bagged the clothing, and they waited for someone to call the station and report a missing person who matched the description. But the phone stayed silent. The medical examiner at the time noted that the victim was a young man, likely in his early 20s, with a build that suggested he had worked outdoors. His clothes were of good quality, the kind of things someone might wear for a weekend trip or a long walk, but they provided no clues to his origin. No labels from local shops, no dry cleaning marks, nothing. It was as if he had materialized out of the fog and then vanished back into it, leaving only his physical form behind. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. Detectives traveled to neighboring states, showing the composite sketch to anyone who would look, but the response was always the same: a shake of the head and a sympathetic look. The mystery victim was becoming a ghost in the machine, a file that moved from the top of the desk to the middle drawer, and finally to the cardboard box in the basement. By the time 1972 arrived, the case was officially cold. The world had moved on to new headlines and new tragedies, leaving the young man from the woods in a nameless grave marked only by a date and a number. For the families of the missing, every day is a battle against the unknown, a persistent ache that never truly goes away. Somewhere, A mother was likely setting a plate for a son who would never come home, and a father was looking out the window at every passing car, hoping to see a familiar face. But because the victim had no name, those two worlds, the grieving family and the forensic file, could never meet. They were two parallel lines traveling through time, destined never to touch unless something fundamental changed in the way we understand the human blueprint. Decades passed. The 70s faded into the 80s, and the neon glow of the 90s arrived, bringing with it the first whispers of a new kind of science. But for the DNA ghost, the silence remained unbroken. The evidence box sat undisturbed, collecting dust in a climate-controlled room that felt like a mausoleum for forgotten stories. The photographs inside began to yellow at the edges, and the ink on the witness statement started to fade. But the essential truth of the case remained. Someone had taken a life, and the world had allowed that life to be forgotten. It is a terrifying thought, isn't it? The idea that you could simply disappear, and that the system meant to find you would eventually just stop looking because it ran out of pages to turn. At some point in the early 2000s, a young detective named Miller was tasked with organizing the cold case archives. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He was just trying to create order out of the chaos of decades of unsolved crimes. But when he opened the 1971 file, the grainy photograph of the young man caught his eye. There was something in the expression of the victim, a sense of lost potential that bothered him. He would later say that it felt like the ghost was reaching out through the paper, asking for his name back. Miller knew that the technology of 1971 had failed this man, but he also knew that the technology of the present was beginning to do the impossible. He looked at the evidence list and saw that a small piece of clothing and a lock of hair had been preserved. It wasn't much, but in the world of modern forensics, it was a goldmine. The possibility of a breakthrough was slim. The DNA was old, degraded by time and the environmental conditions of the storage room. But the science of forensic genealogy was beginning to change the landscape of criminal justice. It was no longer just about matching a suspect to a crime scene. It was about building family trees from the ground up using the same databases people use to find their ancestors. Miller sent the samples to a specialized lab, a place where scientists work in near silence, surrounded by humming machines that can read the secret language of our cells. They weren't looking for a criminal. They were looking for a cousin, a grandparent, anyone who shared a sliver of the ghost's genetic code. While the lab worked, the case remained in a state of quiet anticipation. It was like waiting for a seed to sprout in the middle of winter. The air in the detective's office felt stagnant, thick with the weight of decades-old paper and the faint, metallic scent of the filing cabinets that held the secrets of 1,000 broken lives. Detective Miller knew that the odds were against them. Genetic material, even when stored in the most controlled environments, has a shelf life. It breaks down into fragments, losing the markers that make it a readable map of a human being. In 1971, no one could have imagined that a microscopic strand of protein would one day serve as a voice for the voiceless. At the time, the investigators had relied on shoe leather and intuition, knocking on doors and showing a grainy sketch to strangers who only shook their heads. They were looking for a person in a world that hadn't yet been digitized, where a disappearance could be as final as a stone dropping into a deep well. The lab technicians worked with a level of precision that felt almost meditative. They were dealing with a phantom profile, a sequence of DNA so degraded it appeared as a series of gaps and shadows on their monitors. It was a ghost in the machine. To bridge these gaps, they utilized a process of data enrichment, comparing the broken strands against millions of other profiles in public genealogical databases. It wasn't a quick process. It was a slow, rhythmic unfolding of history. Each match was a tiny light in a vast, dark forest. A third cousin here, a distant great-aunt there. Slowly, the branches of a family tree began to take shape, stretching back through the 20th century, through migrations and marriages, births and burials. They were tracing a lineage that had unknowingly carried the memory of a missing person for over 50 years. While the scientists mapped the past, the physical evidence sat in a climate-controlled room, a silent witness to a crime that the world had largely forgotten. The box labeled 1971 Unidentified was more than just a collection of forensic samples. It was the final resting place of a human identity. Inside, there were photographs of the scene, stark, high-contrast images of a wooded area where the leaves had already turned brittle and brown. There were notes from the original medical examiner, written in a cramped, hurried cursive that spoke of a different era of medicine. The examiner had noted the victim's height, the color of their hair, and the brutal nature of the injuries that had ended their life. But without a name, these details were just data points. They didn't tell the story of a life lived. They didn't mention a favorite song, a childhood home, or the people who had once loved this person and wondered why they never came through the front door again. The silence of the case file was finally broken by a notification from the lab. It wasn't a direct hit, but it was a bridge. A woman in a different state had uploaded her DNA to a site to learn more about her heritage, never suspecting that her curiosity would lead a detective to her door. She was a distant match, a cousin several times removed, but she was the anchor the investigation needed. Detective Miller began the painstaking work of traditional genealogy, cross-referencing census records, obituary archives, and old high school yearbooks. He was looking for a disappearance that matched the timeline of the 1971 discovery. He looked for families that had a missing piece, a brother who went for a drive and never came back, a daughter who moved away and stopped writing letters. In the early 1970s, the culture of the country was in a state of flux. People were moving, reinventing themselves, and sometimes slipping through the cracks was easier than it is today. There were no cell phones to track, no digital footprints to follow. If a person didn't want to be found, or if someone made sure they couldn't be found, they could simply vanish into the background noise of a changing nation. Miller found himself looking into a specific family from a small town several hundred miles away from where the body had been discovered. This family had a story that had been whispered about for decades. A young man, barely 20 years old, had left home in late summer of 1971. He had packed a small bag, told his mother he was looking for work in the city, and then nothing. The family had reported him missing, of course, but in 1971, jurisdictions didn't talk to each other the way they do now. A missing person report in one county rarely made its way to the unidentified body file in another. The two halves of the tragedy existed in parallel, never touching, for half a century. The mother had kept his room exactly as it was for 10 years, waiting for a phone call or a knock. By the time Miller contacted the surviving relatives, the mother had long since passed away, taking her grief and her questions to her own grave. The siblings, now elderly themselves, remembered a brother who was kind, perhaps a bit restless, and full of the quiet optimism of youth. They had grown up in the shadow of his absence, a void that had shaped their family dynamic in ways they were only now beginning to understand. As Miller sat in the living room of the victim's sister, he showed her the composite sketch from 1971. It was a moment of profound sensory collision. The cold, clinical nature of a forensic drawing meeting, the warm, lived-in memories of a sibling. She looked at the sketch for a long time, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the lines of the jaw and the set of the eyes. "It looks like him," she whispered, "but it doesn't look like him." It was the face of a ghost, reconstructed from the remnants of a life. The DNA testing had provided the scientific proof, but this moment provided the human truth. The ghost finally had a name. He wasn't a file number anymore. He was a son, a brother, and a person whose life had intrinsic value. The identification was only the beginning of the second phase of the mystery. Now that they knew who he was, they had to figure out how he ended up in those woods and who was responsible for the violence that took him. The investigation moved from the lab back to the streets, into the memories of those who were still alive from that era. Miller started looking into the victim's final days. Who had he been seen with? Where was he working? The records showed he had taken a job at a local warehouse, a place that had since been torn down and replaced by a shopping mall. He had been living in a small, rented room in a boarding house that no longer existed. Every lead was a fragment of a world that had been paved over, yet the emotional resonance of the case remained sharp. People who hadn't thought about that autumn in 50 years found themselves transported back by the detective's questions. They remembered the music of the time, the smell of the air, and the underlying tension of a society on edge. Slowly, a name began to surface in the old interviews. A man who had worked at the same warehouse, someone with a reputation for a quick temper and a history of minor run-ins with the law. This person had remained in the area for years, living a quiet life, perhaps believing that the secrets he buried in the woods in 1971 would stay there forever. But DNA is a patient witness. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't lie. As Miller closed in on the prime suspect, he realized that the DNA ghost was doing something remarkable. It was reaching across time to demand accountability. The science was complex, but the motive for the investigation was simple. Everyone deserves to be known. Everyone deserves to have their story told to its conclusion. The family, though burdened by the sadness of the truth, felt a strange sense of peace. The silence that had haunted them for 50 years was finally over. The brother they had lost was no longer a phantom. He was home. As the sun began to set over the precinct, casting long, orange shadows across the dusty evidence boxes. Miller felt the weight of the case begin to lift. The 1971 unidentified label would be peeled off, replaced by a name written in bold, permanent ink. It was a reminder that in the world of true crime, justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a slow, rhythmic process of recovery. It's the sound of a name being spoken after half a century of silence. It's the realization that no one is truly forgotten as long as there is someone left to ask the question, who were they? Tonight, as you listen to the rain and feel the warmth of your own bed, let this story remind you of the invisible threads that connect us all. We are all part of a lineage, a history, and a shared human experience. The ghosts of the past are not something to fear. They are voices waiting for the right moment to tell us who we are. The science will continue to evolve. The databases will grow, and more names will be restored to the world. But the heart of the matter will always be the same: the enduring power of the truth to find its way home, no matter how long the journey takes. As we move forward, think of the vastness of the time that passed between that autumn day in 1971 and the moment the DNA finally spoke. Think of the miles traveled and the changes the world endured, while a single name remained hidden. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the relentless pursuit of justice. The silence of 1971 has been broken, and in its place is a story of a life that mattered, a family that remembered, and a ghost that was finally allowed to rest in peace. Rest easy tonight, knowing that the light of truth has a way of finding the deepest shadows, and that you are safe in the quiet of the present moment. The gravel crunched under the tires of the first patrol car to arrive, a sound that seemed to echo much louder than it should have in the stillness of that autumn morning. It was 1971, a year where the world felt like it was moving at a different speed. Yet in this specific corner of the woods, time had seemingly ground to a halt. The officer who stepped out of the vehicle was met with a silence so thick it felt heavy, the kind of quiet that usually precedes a storm or follows a tragedy. As he made his way toward the edge of the clearing, he wasn't expecting to find a mystery that would outlive his own career. He was simply answering a call about something out of place, something that didn't belong among the fallen leaves and the damp earth. What he found was a person who had been reduced to a question mark. The victim lay there, framed by the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, looking almost as if they had simply fallen from the sky. There was no trail of disturbed brush, no signs of a desperate struggle, just the sudden jarring presence of a life cut short. In those first few moments, the investigator did what any lawman of the era would do. He reached for his notepad and a Polaroid camera. The flash of the camera was a brief, artificial intrusion into the gray light of the forest, capturing the scene in grainy, high-contrast squares that would later become the only windows into this moment for future generations. The 1971 investigative notes are a masterclass in professional frustration, a meticulous list of everything the victim wasn't, because they couldn't find a single shred of who they were. The detectives moved with a practiced, methodical grace, their heels clicking on the pavement as they transitioned from the forest floor to the sterile environment of the local morgue. They checked the pockets of the victim's jacket, hoping for the familiar leather of a wallet or the crinkle of a bus ticket. But they found nothing but lint and empty space. There was no ID, no social security card, not even a stray coin that might suggest where they had come from or where they had been going. Every detail was recorded with the clack of a manual typewriter, the rhythmic strike of the keys filling the small precinct office as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The report noted the height, the weight, and the color of the hair, but these were just numbers and physical traits that could apply to thousands of people. They looked for the small things that usually tell a story: the tan line from a wedding ring, a distinctive scar from a childhood accident, or even a label from a specific department store inside the collar of the shirt. But the clothing was generic, the kind of mass-produced items you could buy in any city from coast to coast. There were no jewelry pieces to trace, no dental work that stood out as unique, and no tattoos that might signal a branch of military service or a personal passion. By the time the first night of the investigation drew to a close, a profound sense of loneliness had settled over the case. The victim sat in a cold, metal drawer in the county morgue, a person who had once had a name, a favorite song, and a family who was likely wondering why they hadn't come home. Yet, in the eyes of the law, they were a ghost. The town was small enough that word traveled fast, and soon the local diners and general stores were buzzing with the news of the discovery. People checked their locks a little more carefully that night, looking at their neighbors with a new, subtle layer of suspicion, wondering if a monster was walking among them. But more than fear, there was a collective, unsettling realization that someone could simply vanish from the fabric of society and leave nothing behind but a body in the woods. The investigators worked through the weekend, their desks cluttered with black and white photos that seemed to lose more detail the longer you looked at them. They reached out to neighboring jurisdictions, asking about missing persons reports that might fit the description, but the replies were always the same: no match. It was as if this individual had never existed prior to being found in that clearing. They weren't a runaway. They weren't a traveler reported missing by a worried parent, and they weren't a local face that anyone recognized. The silence of 1971 was beginning to feel permanent, a void that swallowed every lead and every theory the police could muster. The medical examiner's report was equally stark. While it confirmed the cause of death was no accident, it couldn't provide a window into the victim's past. The science of the time was limited. There were no databases to cross-reference, no digital footprints to trace, and certainly no concept of the genetic mapping that would one day change everything. All they had were the physical remains and the cold, hard facts of the crime scene. They documented the state of the victim's hands, noting they were well cared for, suggesting they hadn't spent their life in heavy manual labor. They noted the quality of the shoes, which were worn but sturdy. These tiny details were like breadcrumbs that led nowhere. Serving only to humanize a person, the system was already beginning to label as a John Doe. As the weeks turned into months, the frantic energy of the initial discovery began to fade into a dull, persistent ache for the community. The mystery victim became a fixture of local lore, a story told in hushed tones over coffee, but the leads dried up. The file, once thick with fresh reports and witness statements, began to gather dust on a shelf in the basement of the sheriff's office. Every time a new detective was hired, they would eventually find their way to that folder, drawn in by the sheer impossibility of a person remaining nameless in a world that felt so interconnected. They would flip through the grainy Polaroids, staring into the frozen expression of the victim, searching for something, anything, that their predecessors had missed. They would later realize that the answers weren't hidden in the physical notes or the measurements of the bones. The answers were buried deep inside the very cells of the victim, waiting for a technology that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. At the time, however, the investigators could only feel the weight of their own limitations. They were men of action and instinct, used to chasing down suspects and knocking on doors. But you can't knock on the door of a memory that no one seems to have. The victim remained a ghost, a silent inhabitant of the county's records, remembered only by the few who had seen them lying in that remote, quiet location. The tragedy of the case wasn't just the violence of the end, but the erasure of the beginning. A life consists of thousands of days, millions of conversations, and countless connections to other people. To have all of that wiped away, leaving only a clinical description in a police file, is a special kind of horror. It suggests a vulnerability that most of us don't like to acknowledge. The idea that we could be separated from our identity by nothing more than a lack of paperwork. The detectives felt this, even if they didn't have the words for it. They saw the victim not just as a case to be solved, but as a person who had been robbed of their dignity twice, once by their killer, and once by the anonymity of their death. As the 1970s bled into the 80s, the world changed. Technology began to creep into the police station. The manual typewriters were replaced by early computers, and the filing systems became more organized. But the mystery victim stayed the same. The Polaroids faded, the edges of the paper turned yellow, and the officers who first walked into that clearing retired, taking their memories of the smell of the woods and the chill of the morning with them. The case was no longer a headline. It was a ghost story, a footnote in the history of the department. Yet, in that cold morgue, and later in a marked but nameless grave, the victim waited. There is a certain kind of patience that comes with the afterlife of a cold case. It is a patience born of necessity. A long, quiet interval where the only thing moving is the slow accumulation of dust on a cardboard box, labeled with a case number instead of a name. The year 1971 had been a time of transition for the country. But in this specific remote patch of earth, time seemed to have folded in on itself. The community that had been so shaken by the initial discovery began to heal. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say, they began to forget. People stopped looking over their shoulders when they walked to their cars at night. The local newspaper moved on to the politics of the new decade, and the clearing where the victim was found was reclaimed by the ferns and the heavy, damp moss of the forest floor. But for the investigators, the silence of 1971 wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a lack of direction. When the first responders had arrived on that crisp morning, they were operating in a world that felt much larger and more disconnected than the one we inhabit today. There were no digital databases to query, no instant background checks, and certainly no way to broadcast a victim's likeness to millions of people with the press of a button. They had their Polaroids, which developed with a slow chemical hiss, revealing a scene that was both clinical and heartbreaking. They had their measuring tapes, recorded in careful cursive script. They looked for the small things, the things that make a person a person. They searched for a library card, a crumpled receipt, or a photograph tucked into a hidden pocket. They found nothing. The victim was a blank slate, wearing clothing that was common, functional, and devoid of any store tags or laundry marks that might have hinted at a city of origin. It was as if this person had simply materialized in the woods, only to be extinguished. The medical examiner at the time noted the physical state of the victim with a detachment that was necessary for the job. Yet even in those dry reports, a sense of professional frustration began to leak through. The 1971 investigative notes are a masterclass in professional frustration. A meticulous list of everything the victim wasn't, because they couldn't find a single shred of who they were. They weren't a local runaway. They weren't a reported missing person from the neighboring 3 counties. They weren't carrying the keys to a car parked nearby. They were simply there, a physical presence in a world that had no record of them. As the sun began to set on that very first day of the investigation, a profound sense of loneliness settled over the scene. The technicians packed up their kits. The yellow police tape fluttered in the evening breeze, and the victim was transported to a cold morgue. In the basement of the county building, under the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing pulse, the victim lay on a stainless steel table. There was no one to call. There was no family waiting by a telephone, because no one knew where they had gone. There was no one to identify the body, no friend to recognize the curve of a jaw or the color of eyes that had seen their last sunset in a place they likely didn't belong. This was the beginning of the ghost phase of the case. In the early 1970s, an unidentified victim was often buried in a potter's field if no leads materialized within a few weeks. The system was designed for efficiency, not for the long-term storage of mysteries. Each day that passed without a name felt like another layer of earth being piled onto the truth. The detectives would sit in their offices, the sound of 1970s typewriters clacking away in the background, filling out forms that would eventually be tucked into a manila folder. They would stare at the grainy texture of the black and white police photos, looking for a detail they might have missed in the shadows. Was that a faint scar on the finger? Was the wear on the shoes indicative of a certain type of manual labor? They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack was the size of the entire country. At the time, if a person disappeared in one state and ended up in another, the chances of the 2 jurisdictions connecting the dots were statistically slim. Communication was handled through physical mail and expensive long-distance phone calls. Teletypes were slow and limited in their character counts. In 1971, if a name wasn't written on a tag in the back of a shirt, that person could easily slip through the cracks of the world. As the weeks became months, the silence of 1971 became the foundation for everything that would follow. the community would still whisper about the ghost in the woods. But for the investigators, the mystery wasn't a spectral presence. It was a physical person they had seen, touched, and documented, but could never truly know. They had measured the height, recorded the approximate weight, and even taken fingerprints that were sent to the FBI in a thick manila envelope. But in a time before the digital age, if those fingerprints weren't already in a file somewhere, if they didn't belong to a soldier, a government worker, or a convicted criminal, they were just lines on a card that meant nothing to the world. The case of the 1971 mystery victim would eventually be shelved, but it was never truly forgotten. It remained a cold spot in the warm hum of the department's daily business. Every few years, a new detective would pull the file, hoping for a fresh perspective, only to find the same meticulous list of everything the victim wasn't. They would see the Polaroids, now curled at the edges and losing their color, and they would see the meticulous handwriting of an officer who had long since passed away. The victim was a phantom in the system, a DNA ghost before we even had a word for what that meant. The loneliness of that first night in the morgue, as the investigators went home to their own families and their own lives, would stretch out for 5 decades. It was a stillness that was almost palpable. The victim remained in a state of suspended animation, a body without a story, a face without a name. The only thing left behind was a profound, aching absence, a space in the world where a person should have been. This initial discovery in 1971 was more than just a crime. It was a challenge to the world's ability to remember its own. The immediate shock to the local community eventually faded into the background noise of life. But for those who had stood in that clearing, the image of the victim remained as clear as the black and white police photos they had filed away. They didn't know who they were looking for, but they knew they were looking for a human soul that had been erased. The typewriter clacking would stop, the lights would be turned off, and the folder would be placed back on the shelf, leaving the victim in the dark for what many thought would be forever. But the silence of 1971 was only the first chapter of a story that would take 50 years to tell. As we move forward into the next phase of this journey, we have to understand the depth of that silence. It wasn't just a lack of information, it was a lack of hope. The investigative tools of the 1970s were remarkable for their time, but they were ultimately defeated by the anonymity of the victim. There was no wallet. There was no ID. There was only a body and the quiet woods and the cold, unyielding fact that someone had died without a name. The story of the DNA ghost isn't just about the science that would eventually solve it. It's about the decades of stillness that preceded the breakthrough and the quiet, persistent memory of those who refused to let a human being simply vanish into the shadows of history. As the years rolled on, the world would forget the victim, but the victim was always there, waiting in a nameless grave, waiting for the technology of a future they could never have imagined to catch up with their story. The silence of 1971 was a heavy shroud, but even the thickest shroud has a thread that can be pulled, and even the most erased name can be rewritten if the right hands are doing the writing. For now, in our story, The victim is still a ghost, a presence in the morgue, a name that hasn't yet been spoken. By the time the sun began to set on that first week of the investigation in 1971, the initial surge of adrenaline among the local deputies had begun to sour into a lingering, heavy frustration. They had combed through the brush where the body was found, sifting through layers of damp earth and pine needles, hoping for the one thing that would anchor this person to a life. A wallet, a house key, even a distinctive piece of jewelry. Anything that could transform a victim into a daughter, a sister, or a friend. But as the evidence bags remained largely empty of personal effects, a chilling realization began to settle over the sheriff's office. It wasn't just that she had been killed. It was as if she had been systematically erased from the world before she ever reached that lonely stretch of woods. According to the original case files, the lead detective spent the first 72 hours staring at a growing pile of missing persons reports from neighboring counties and then neighboring states. He looked for a girl who liked the outdoors, a girl who might have been traveling alone, or a girl whose family hadn't heard from her in a few days. But 1971 was a different world. It was a time of transient movement, of hitchhiking culture, and young people seeking a new kind of freedom on the open road. If someone stopped writing home, it wasn't always seen as a tragedy. Sometimes, it was just seen as a choice. This cultural backdrop created a vast, silent space where people could slip through the cracks of society without a ripple. The medical examiner sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room, trying to piece together the final moments of a life he knew nothing about. He noted the way her clothing was worn, the specific brand of her shoes, and the fact that she had recently seen a dentist. These were the only fingerprints she had left behind, the physical evidence of a routine life that had been abruptly and violently interrupted. He could tell her age, her height, and the approximate time her heart had stopped beating, but he could not tell the detectives what she had been dreaming of, or who was currently sitting at a kitchen table somewhere, waiting for a phone call that would never come. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation hit its first significant wall. This was the cold wall, the moment when the leads dry up and the public's attention starts to wander toward the next headline. In a small town, a murder is a monumental event, a crack in the glass of safety that everyone relies on. But without a name, the victim remained a ghost, a theoretical tragedy rather than a human one. The local newspapers began to refer to her as the Jane Doe of the woods, a title that stripped away her personhood and replaced it with a clinical label. To the investigators, she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. To the community, she was a shadow that made them lock their doors a little tighter at night. Detectives traveled to nearby truck stops and diners, showing a grainy black and white sketch that a police artist had produced. The sketch showed a young woman with soft features and an expression that the artist had tried to make. Looked peaceful, but there was an inherent haunting quality to it. "Do you recognize her?" they would ask, holding the paper up to waitresses who had seen thousands of faces that month. "Did she come through here for a cup of coffee? Was she with anyone?" The answer was always a slow shake of the head. In the pre-digital age, if you didn't have a name, you didn't have a history. You were just a face in a crowd, and once that crowd moved on, you were forgotten. The frustration within the department was palpable. They knew that somewhere there was a house with an empty bedroom. There was a mother who was perhaps telling herself that her daughter was just busy, or that the mail was slow. There was a father who checked the driveway every time he heard a car slow down. The silence of the victim was echoed by the silence of the world that had lost her. It was a two-way street of missing information. The police couldn't find the family because they didn't know who to look for, and the family couldn't find the police because they didn't know where their loved one had ended up. At the time, forensic science was in its infancy. There were no databases to cross-reference dental records on a national scale. There was no DNA profiling to link a strand of hair to a distant cousin. There was only blood typing, which was far too broad to be of any real use in identification, and fingerprints, which were only helpful if the person had already been processed through the military or the criminal justice system. Our Jane Doe was neither a soldier nor a criminal. She was a vulnerable soul who had likely lived a quiet life, leaving no paper trail and no digital footprint in an era that didn't yet know what that was. By the time the first month had passed, the case was moved from the active desk to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. It wasn't that the detectives didn't care. It was simply that they had run out of places to look. They had checked the bus logs. They had spoken to the local transients. And they had sent her description out over the teletype to every station in the region. But the universe remained tight-lipped. The forest where she was found had already begun to grow over the spot where she had lain, the earth reclaiming the physical space while the mystery continued to hang in the air like a thick fog. One detective, a man who would later spend his retirement thinking about this case, kept a copy of that police sketch in the sun visor of his car. He would look at it while he sat at red lights, wondering if he had missed something, a small detail in her clothing, a specific way her hair was parted, or a clue in the soil that had been overlooked. He felt a sense of personal failure, a weight on his shoulders that came from the knowledge that he was the only person left who was actively looking for her identity. To the rest of the world, she was becoming a statistic. To him, she was a responsibility. The cold wall is a physical sensation for those in law enforcement. It's the feeling of a door being slammed and locked from the inside. They knew the killer was likely still out there, perhaps even still in the area, watching the news and realizing with a dark sense of relief that the police didn't even know who they were looking for. Without a victim's identity, establishing a motive is almost impossible. You cannot trace her last steps if you don't know where her first steps began. You cannot look into her inner circle if you don't know who she loved or who she feared. The erasure of her name was the killer's greatest weapon, and in 1971, it was a weapon that worked perfectly. As the seasons changed and the first snow began to fall over the mountains, the Jane Doe of the woods became a permanent fixture of the county's cold case files. The file was thin, mostly consisting of the autopsy report, a few Polaroids of the scene, and the hundreds of no-match letters from other jurisdictions. It was a testament to the limitations of the era. The technology of the time had reached its zenith and found itself wanting. The investigation hadn't just slowed down, it had stopped. The trail hadn't just gone cold, it had frozen solid. Imagine, if you will, the vastness of the American landscape in the early 70s. Thousands of miles of highway, endless stretches of forest, and small towns separated by hours of driving. It was a place where one could easily become lost, both literally and figuratively. For our mystery victim, the vastness of the geography was matched only by the vastness of the bureaucracy. Information moved at the speed of a postage stamp. A missing person report filed in New York might take weeks to reach a sheriff's office in the Pacific Northwest, and even then, it might be filed away by a clerk who didn't see the connection. It was a system built on manual labor and human memory, both of which are notoriously fallible. The story of the 1971 murder became a local legend, the kind of tale told around campfires or whispered by teenagers looking to scare one another. "Don't go out past the creek," they would say, "or you'll end up like the girl with no name." It was a cruel irony. The girl who had once been a living, breathing person with favorite songs and childhood memories was now a ghost story used to keep children in line. Her humanity had been replaced by a cautionary tale. But beneath the layers of local folklore, the reality remained. A person had been taken, a crime had been committed, and the scales of justice were tilted heavily toward the dark. Years in prison were what the killer deserved. But as the calendar flipped from 1971 to 1972, and then to 1975, the chances of that happening seemed to dwindle toward zero. The witness's memories began to fade. The truck stops where she might have been seen were torn down and replaced by modern gas stations. The detectives who had worked the case were promoted, or they moved away, or they passed away, taking their gut feelings and their private theories with them to the grave. The case file grew yellow and brittle, tucked away in a basement where the hum of the furnace was the only sound. At some point, the legal system has to move on. New crimes occur, new victims need attention, and the resources of a small department are limited. The Jane Doe of the woods was eventually buried in a potter's field, a section of the cemetery reserved for those whose families cannot be found. Her headstone didn't bear a name, it bore a date and a case number. It was a final, cold indignity, to be returned to the earth under a number given to her by the state. The silence was now absolute. The erased name seemed to be a permanent condition, a secret that the 1971 woods would keep forever. But while the world moved on, the evidence remained. Hidden in a climate-controlled locker, a small box contained the clothing she had worn and a few strands of hair collected during the autopsy. At the time, these items were considered useless, relics of a failed investigation. No one could have predicted that the microscopic code contained within those fibers would one day act as a bridge across time. No one knew that the technology being dreamed up in laboratories decades later would eventually reach back into the past and pull this girl out of the shadows. As you listen tonight, think about the silence of those 40-plus years. Think about the quiet life that was lived before the tragedy, and the way that life was nearly forgotten by history. The Cold Wall is not just a barrier for the police, it is a barrier for the human spirit. It represents the moments when we lose our connection to one another, But as we will later see, that connection is never truly broken. It is merely waiting for the right moment and the right light to be revealed once again. The investigators found that as the years passed, the Jane Doe case became a sort of rite of passage for new detectives. Every few years, someone would pull the file, look at the grainy photos, and try to apply a new lens to the old facts. They would check the new computerized databases, hoping for a hit that their predecessors couldn't have imagined. But the records show that for decades, the result was always the same. No match, no name, no lead. It was a cycle of hope and disappointment that defined the case for nearly half a century. The possibility of justice seemed to vanish with each passing decade. By the 1990s, the case was over 20 years old. By the early 2000s, it was 30. The Jane Doe was no longer a contemporary mystery. She was a historical one. She was a DNA ghost, a phantom in the system that refused to be laid to rest, but lacked the voice to speak her own truth. The case remained a shadow in the corner of the department's history, a reminder of the one they couldn't save, and the one they couldn't name. Rest assured, the story does not end in that potter's field. The journey from the silence of 1971 to the breakthrough of the modern era is one of persistence, of science, and of a refusal to let a human life remain erased. As we move forward, we will see how the smallest piece of information, a literal ghost of a molecule, began to unravel a mystery that had stood for generations. But for now, we leave the investigation in the quiet of the 1970s, where the name was lost, and the wall was high, and the woods kept their secret under the cover of night.